Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves globally. Around 17% of the oil reserves are there, about 303 billion barrels. So that's not something we can ignore, of course. It has also the 8th largest natural gas reserves, in addition to mineral riches, so from gold to diamonds, and including now to rare earths. The US views the Western Hemisphere as a natural area of influence of the United States. So it's important to the Trump administration that China, Russia, Iran do not have like a free pass to be present in the continent.
Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm its founder and your host, Adam Taggart. At the time of this recording, tensions are high between the US and Venezuela. American warships have been deployed off Venezuela's coast. Speculation of a US-driven regime change to oust Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is all over the headlines. And just a few days ago, US officials told Reuters that the United States is, quote, poised to launch a new phase of Venezuelan-related operations in the coming days. So, how did we get to this boiling point? What's most likely to happen from here? And what would the geopolitical and economic implications of a regime change in Venezuela be? For perspective, in this Thoughtful Money special report, we're fortunate to be joined today by Mario Braga, Latin American geopolitical analyst for RANE. Mario, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Adam. It's my pleasure to be here.
All right. Well, look, I very much appreciate you doing this. We've done this in the past with some of your colleagues to give us kind of real-time insights for other conflicts that have gone around the world, most notably in the Middle East. Very much appreciating you coming here upon request to do this for us in Venezuela here. So Mario, if you can, let's start just kind of by leaning back for a second here. Set the table for us. Like, what is the history of the bad blood between the US and the Maduro regime?
Sure. I think when we think about Venezuela, the thing that comes to many people's minds is Chávez Maduro, this socialist autocracy that came to be. But it's important to take a step back and understand how they came to power and then how the dynamics between Venezuela and the US changed over the past decades. Because basically, Venezuela, after gaining independence, and I promise I'll not make this into a Venezuelan history class, but
That's okay.
it was autocracy until the 1950s. And then in 1958, there is the Punto Fijo Pact. The main three political parties agree to respect election results. And then Venezuela has a democratic period starting in 1958. But of course, with these political arrangements, they become fragile at some point. They stop working. And with Venezuela, of course, oil prices had a lot to do with that. So when we come to the late 80s and early 90s, that's already crumbling down. And that's basically when Hugo Chávez, who then was a career military officer, who had already founded a Bolivarian militia within the army. In 1992, he tries to stage a coup to get to power. He does not succeed. He's arrested. And then one can think, well, that's the end. He's in jail. He's not coming back. But that's not what happens, because a couple of years later, he's pardoned. And he became this voice for the dissatisfaction that there was within Venezuelan society with the existing political establishment. So in 1998, he gets to power via democratic norms. He's elected. And he comes to power with a very ideological approach to governing. So he declared himself a Marxist. So he sees the US and labels the US as an imperialist regime. And then he starts to turn Venezuela from what used to be kind of a regular Latin American democracy, of course, with corruption, with many issues. But he makes a lot of constitutional changes, and he grows increasingly autocratic over the years by relying on the large oil reserves that he had. So cash handouts, social programs, social benefits to have this popular support at the same time when he's deteriorating the country's institutions, the kind of electoral rules. He managed to kind of hold sham elections to remain in power. And that works, especially in the 2000s, on the back of the commodities boom that was mostly driven by China. And because of high oil prices, Venezuela has high revenues, and he manages to establish this very well structured apparatus. The thing is that when we turn to the 2010s, the economy is not doing so well. The oil prices are not that high. The revenues start to decline. And then Chavez passes away in 2013. So he had appointed by then Maduro to be like his successor. So when Maduro comes to power, the situation is different. And then he struggles to keep the regime going as it was before. You start to see protests against the sham elections. Because of that, there is more repression. There is the exodus from the country. It's the kind of the most severe humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere. 8 million Venezuelans have left the country. And then I think from there, we get to the point where we are now, that we had in the first Trump administration, the US step up in pressure against Maduro, trying to oust him. After that, during the pandemic, the Biden administration trying to re-engage, trying to see a diplomatic way out. And now during the Trump second term, you have an even kind of increased pressure resorting to the military buildup that we are seeing off the coast of Venezuela.
Okay, so I'm no expert on this, so I'm so glad you're here. From a administration viewpoint, from what I can tell from the headlines, is they don't like the Maduro regime because you can make a human rights case, right? Which is, hey, we just don't think you mentioned a big humanitarian crisis there that's been going on for a long time. But it's, hey, a lot of the illegal immigrants that came in, especially during the Biden administration, a lot were from Venezuela. Totally understandable, seeking a better life here than what they were able to get there under Maduro. But President Trump, accurately or not, curious if you have a thought on this, has said, hey, Venezuela is actually kind of pushing people on us, and in particular, it's clearing out its prisons and its insane asylums, and it's kind of sending us kind of the dregs of their country and dumping it on the U.S. So there's that claim. There's the other claim that Venezuela has become sort of a narco-terrorist state and is pushing drugs into America that are killing Americans. And obviously, one of the things that the administration has dialed up recently is hey, we're just going to start blowing up watercraft that we see starting to leave Venezuela to hopefully make them think twice about doing that. So there are all those are the negatives that a regular person like me is hearing kind of against Venezuela from our current administration. I've got to assume too that beyond just out of the goodness of its heart and trying to improve the situation there for Venezuela's suffering citizens, that the administration is also, and this isn't, I don't think, unique to Trump, but the America government is also really hoping for regime change in Venezuela to get somebody who's a lot more America friendly and can unlock the ability of America and other Western countries to tap the vast riches in Venezuela, oil being a huge one, and having everybody make a lot more money than they're making right now. Is that a pretty accurate summation of the pros and the cons, or is there more to the story than what a regular guy like me gets?
Yeah, definitely, as you laid out, Venezuela, I think, ticks a lot of the boxes when you think about US foreign policy priorities, especially for the Western Hemisphere and what the Trump administration has put out as its kind of, even from during the campaign, as its priority. So you're right when you talk about migration, drug trafficking, democracy in the hemisphere as well. But when we look at the Venezuelan case, I think we need to also take a step back and see why it's so strategic and why it's so relevant in that regard, especially to the Trump administration. Because when we think about the drug trafficking angle, for example, Venezuela is not a country that produces drugs. The main cocaine producer is Colombia, and the fact that Venezuela has a very porous border with Colombia, and that Venezuela has a large Caribbean coast, that what happens is that it has become a transit country. And what happens is, because of increased oversight in Colombia over the past decades, including Plan Colombia, all the US partnership, what drug traffickers started to do is that it's easier for them to carry the drugs to the Venezuelan side of the border, and then from Venezuela, traffic the drugs either by plane. The vast majority of the drug that is trafficked via aerial routes come from Venezuela. So they go to kind of these clandestine airstrips in the middle of the jungle, or even some military bases that we can dive into a bit later on the role that the military from Venezuela plays into drug trafficking. And then they take to Central America, to southern Mexico, and then that cocaine is smuggled into the US. So there is that drug trafficking angle.
All right, sorry. So just to make sure I'm clear, so it's really more Colombia is the producer, but Venezuela is the distributor.
Yeah, Venezuela works as this, so to speak, logistic hub, right? So from Venezuela, because we can see when we think about just this November 24th, the US designated the Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization, a foreign terrorist organization. But we need to understand what is the Cartel de los Soles. The de los Soles is like Cartel of the Suns, and that was one of the badges that the generals in Venezuela use in their uniforms. So that was the informal way in which Venezuelans referred to corrupt army generals or military officials, those that were involved in illegal activities, including drug trafficking. They were like informally referred to as the Cartel de los Soles. So it's not an organization as we have, for example, Tren de Aragua, which is a cartel from Venezuela, or even the Sinaloa cartel, or Al Qaeda, for example, if you're trying to think about terrorist groups more broadly, in which there is a clear structure. What happens in Venezuela is that Maduro runs an autocracy, and he needs the support of the military to remain in power, right? He cannot rely on the votes. We saw the July 2024 election that the evidence shows that he lost by 3-1. There have been increasing protests. So if he cannot rely on popular support or on democratic norms, he needs to rely on the armed forces and the security apparatus. To retain that support, what he has done is he has appointed between 2,000 and 2,500 army generals, which is a incredibly high number for any standards, especially in a country like Venezuela that doesn't have such a well-developed armed forces, for example. And the reason why he has done that is that beyond the prestige or the salary that they could benefit, many of these generals are involved in illegal activities inside Venezuela, including drug trafficking. So when you look at some of the air bases or some other military assets or even ports, they are what we call as dual use. So they can be a front that is from the Venezuelan armed forces, but they are also used by drug traffickers. As I said, because there is the kind of the agreement or the kind of consent from the government in Venezuela to allow these drug trafficking activities. So that's why Venezuela has become this important hub for drug distribution that is produced not only in Colombia, but also Peru, Ecuador. And of course, there are other routes that go through Brazil, they go through Guyana, but Venezuela is a major hub in that regard. So from the drug trafficking perspective, of course, that is a connection. Then, as you said, when we think about the economy, Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves globally. Around 17% of the oil reserves are there, about 303 billion barrels. So that's not something we can ignore, of course. It has also the 8th largest natural gas reserves, in addition to mineral riches. So from gold to diamonds, and including now to rare earths. And that's important as well. And I think something that you did not mention, but we also need to take into account is the geopolitical alliance and the alignment of Venezuela, and why that is so important, not only to the US, but specifically to the Trump administration. Because during the 2000s, when Hugo Chavez was in power, and I said that he was leveraging the large oil reserves and he had a very anti-Western, anti-US rhetoric, he became a very close ally with Russia, for example. So back then, Chavez built one of the most sophisticated air defense systems in Latin America, purchasing Russian weaponry. Then, of course, all of the commodities trading, close ally to China. China at some point provided a lot of funds to Venezuela as well. So Venezuela became a hub for interests that not only were not aligned to those of the US, but to some extent opposed to those of the US. So Russia, China, and also Iran. And that's something that when you have an administration that is reassessing the role of the US internationally in other parts of the world, to the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the role with China, even the willingness and capacity to cooperate with Europe and Ukraine. The Trump administration is shifting that focus back to the Western Hemisphere. And this is what has been called the Monroe Doctrine 2.0, which is basically the Western Hemisphere is like the US views the Western Hemisphere as an area, a natural area of influence of the United States. So it's important to the Trump administration that China, Russia, Iran do not have like a free pass to be present in the continent. And then, of course, when we think that the Secretary of State is Marco Rubio, who is of Cuban descent, who has a very strong position against leftist autocracies in Latin America. Of course, we're talking about Cuba. We're also talking about Nicaragua, but then Venezuela also becomes an important player because Cuba and Venezuela help each other out. So a way to bring down the Cuban regime is also is directly linked to bringing down the Venezuelan regime. So all of these different drivers, they play a role in making Venezuela so important, specifically to the Trump administration.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for adding the piece of the puzzle in terms of the geopolitical alliances with sort of America's, enemies, the folks that aren't on Team America. I'd meant to ask you about that and just didn't, so I'm so glad you brought that up here. Okay, so let me ask you this. So if Maduro were to be removed, and we'll talk in a moment about the ways in which that might happen, but let's just assume for a moment that the U.S. somehow successfully effects regime change here with Maduro. What's likely to happen from a governance standpoint? Like, who is likely to step in? Are we likely to get an opposition leader to come in who's much more West friendly? And I think we all learned one of their names. I can't remember what her name is, but because she won the Nobel Peace Prize last month.
María Corina Machado. She's the most prominent figure from the opposition, indeed.
Okay, so is the country just sort of looking for Maduro to get out of the way so they can put somebody like her in, or if Maduro would be removed, would we likely just get a Maduro 2.0, the next successor in the Chavez line? What's more likely there, do you think?
Yeah, that's the big thing is the first part of your question, that it really depends on how this process evolves and if we get a decapitation of the regime or even some sort of agreement that includes an asylum, either not only to Maduro, but to the kind of his inner circle. And then we would have a room for the opposition to take office. But if not, there are some people who claim that a way out and that could be peaceful would be what they're calling Madurismo without Maduro. So Maduro is out, he goes to asylum, he leaves Venezuela, but the structure remains in place. And then we could have one of his four closest allies taking office. I think this is unlikely, but just to have in mind who these people might be, we're talking about Diosdado Cabello, which is the Interior and Justice Minister. We're talking about Vladimir Padrino Lopez, who is the Defense Minister. We're talking about Delcy Rodriguez, who is the Vice President and Oil Minister, and her brother Jorge Lopez, who is the President of the National Assembly and some sort of a power broker in Venezuela. So this is his inner circle. If we see some sort of kind of agreement or deal that includes Maduro leaving the country, but the structure remaining in place, these would be among probably the people that would retain part of the power. But even in that scenario, I think we can anticipate some sort of struggle, internal disputes, other generals, perhaps parts of the military trying to take over. So I think any scenario when we talk about removing Maduro is uncertain. If we are talking about a scenario in which Maduro is removed, but also the higher rankings of both the government and the military, because we need to have in mind that for decades now, Chavez and Maduro, they have purged the military to an extent that the regime can be called like coup-proof, in this sense that they really have only loyalists
It's all their buddies, yeah, at this point, yeah.
Exactly. And then, of course, as I said before, you have generals running like drug trafficking, but you also have generals appointed to key positions in the country's state-owned oil company, for example, PDVSA. So, and across, of course, the government and across other institutions. So, in a scenario in which you have the opposition coming to power and trying to govern, they would really need to do a very comprehensive work of reinstitutionalizing the country. But in that scenario, I think the most likely we could have the results of the July 2024 presidential election being respected, so to speak, because in July 2024, Venezuela voted for president, and Maduro claimed he won without showing any proof. But what happened was that the opposition was very well prepared for what they expected to be a sham election. And as you mentioned, María Corina Machado, who is this leader, she was barred from running, but she had a candidate kind of stepping in for her, who is Edmundo González Urrutia. And he won, and they were able to show the tallies of the ballots, showing that he won nearly with like more than 70% of the vote. And he was acknowledged and recognized as president-elect, even though he did not take office. So we could have him returning to Venezuela. He's now in exile in Spain. He would probably be the head of government. He would be like the president, but the power, the de facto power, I think would most likely rely with Maria Corina Machado, because not only she has the charisma and the popularity, but she has been already engaging with the international community, with investors, with the private sector. She's doing what we could call even as road shows. She has laid out, and we can get into detail later, but like what would a transition period look like? What would a 15-year investment plan for Venezuela look like? So she's trying to really come up with a case that there could be an orderly transition, and she would probably be the one calling the shots, regardless of her position, say interior minister, vice president, or anything in those lines. So I think these are the main names to watch when we think about the transition in Venezuela.
Okay, so how do you see that latter option being affected, where the current power structure in Venezuela agrees to say, all right, you know what, we're going to let those election results stand, and we're going to leave, and we're going to let Machado and her whole team come on in. Do you see any way that that could happen diplomatically, or is that something that's going to need like military intervention on behalf of America?
Yeah, that scenario for us is one of the most unlikely ones, and there are some reasons for that. As I said before, we are not just talking about Maduro and, say, five close allies or advisors that run the whole regime now. We are talking about hundreds of people, both from the kind of the political side within the government, but also within the armed forces, that are involved in illegal activities from, as I said, drug trafficking, but also human rights abuses and other sorts of violations. That if the regime collapses, if Maduro is out, they would highly likely face charges, either in Venezuela or in the United States, or both, or face prison time. So there is a lot of pressure within the government to avoid a negotiated solution, because the number of people that would not be contemplated with some sort of benefit, some asylum somewhere and go live in Russia or Cuba, but would instead go to jail is very large. So this is one of the constraints that we see for why a peaceful and orderly transition is unlikely. And even if, like, working on the hypothesis that that happens, as I said before, you still have a large number of people that have been appointed by Maduro, by Chávez over the past decades that are loyalists, including within the armed forces, that they could resort to some sort of internal armed conflict. They could hide in the country's jungles, the mountains regions, or even within Caracas, the large cities, and resort to sabotage campaigns or try to assassinate new officials. They can really make it hard for the new government, not only to exert power, but even to instill confidence. Because when we talk about what we can expect for a transition and for what investments may look like, it will be very critical that the new administration is able to convince investors that not only it is committed to change, to rule of law, to welcoming the private sector again, but also that it has the ability and the control to rule over the country, to govern properly. So I think that that's why it's so unlikely and so hard to see a scenario in which you have the opposition coming in and we just have like kind of a so-called velvet revolution as we saw in the Czech Republic, for example.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about what's going on right now. So I've mentioned a couple of times that the U.S. has sent a lot of warships near and around Venezuela, and we're doing these, targeted missile strikes to suspected drug crafts that are leaving. What exactly is going on there? And I guess from a do you see the U.S. as trying to drive aggressively regime change there? And if so, how is it doing it? If the military is the stick, hey, you better do something because we've got all this firepower here. Is there also a carrot going on here? Are they having diplomatic discussions? Like what is actually happening right now, as best you understand?
Yeah, so we need to have in mind that this naval buildup in the Caribbean is the largest in decades. It's larger than what we saw, at least since the invasion of Panama in 1989. But even then, when we think about, yes, the US invaded Panama, it ousted General Noriega, but the US already had bases in Panama. It got to a point where it deployed 28,000 troops, and now it just has around 15,000, which is still a lot, but Venezuela is much, much larger than Panama, for example.
Okay. And sorry, where are those troops? Are they all on ships? Or are they actually on the
Yeah,
ground somewhere?
no, they're all on mostly the ships, but also some in Puerto Rico, for example, in the bases. But I think that when there are nearly a dozen warships in the region, which is a lot. Earlier this month, earlier in November, the USS Gerald Ford, which is the largest warship in the US and the world, basically arrived with additional troops. So that's how we got to these 15,000. And of course, the firepower that we have there is unprecedented, and Venezuela does not compare the military capacity that Venezuela has to fight that. But at the same time, and that's the tricky question and how to assess what the objectives of the Trump administration really is, because that's a lot of firepower to fight drug trafficking, right? You don't need a warship or even when talk about a dozen warships to fight drug trafficking. But at the same time, 15,000 troops is not enough to carry out a ground invasion and take over a country, especially a country the size of Venezuela, with the geography, as I said before, part of the country's jungle, part of the country's mountains. It has kind of armed forces that are not only the military, but there are all the militias. What Maduro has done over the past month is handing out rifles and arms to the population, training the population for some sort of like guerrilla tactics to kind of create at least some sort of friction, or create, even if you're talking about the kind of civilian casualties, that creates a cost to the US in assessing if it's gonna decide to invade or not. So the way we see this is there is at this stage a show of force, of course. The attacks on the drug trafficking boats are part of this broader narrative of fighting drug trafficking in the region. But we see the US seeking to create the conditions for regime change or regime collapse within Venezuela without necessarily being the main actor doing that. So just so I can explain more clearly, our baseline scenario with like a 40% likelihood is that the US will escalate its current operations. So now, as you said, we have the US military attacking drug trafficking boats, allegedly drug trafficking boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. We see the US moving that to some kinetic attacks inside the Venezuelan territory, targeting mostly assets linked to drug trafficking. So, as I said before, these can be airstrips, these can be assets linked to the military because they are dual use, they are also used for drug trafficking. Of course, they would seek to kind of undermine Venezuela's air defense capabilities. But we don't see, at least in the first couple of months, the US targeting, for example, political targets in Caracas, the presidential palace, or seeking to target Maduro in a direct attack, for example, because we think that the political costs for the Trump administration would be too high to have its fingerprints in a regime change action in Venezuela. So it's better for them to have this military deployment, to wait a bit, because now in the past few weeks, Trump just said that they would engage in negotiations again. Just this week, he said he may talk to Maduro face to face. So there is this suspense in the air that there may be room for negotiations, but at the same time, Maduro, what has been reported that Maduro offered was, yes, I promise to step down in 2-3 years, or I can give American companies preferential access to oil and mineral contracts. And the White House reportedly turned down these offers because they want kind of regime change now, right? Him stepping down now. So that's why it's also unlikely to be this kind of negotiations, and why we'll likely see an escalation to attacks inland now.
Okay. And is there any hope here on the White House, as best you can tell, of Maduro just changing his tune and saying, "Whoa, okay, US, sorry, I didn't mean to be so off the page. I'm now going to get on the page with you, and sure, I'll open up to you, and I'll start doing some more of the things you want." Is there any probability of that, or are they kind of more hoping for? I think you said it's unrealistic to expect that they'll just honor the previous election results, but are they kind of hoping that maybe like one of Maduro's lieutenants maybe kind of knifes him in the back and then says, "Hey, America, I'm willing to play ball"?
Yeah, when we think that the US raised the bounty on Maduro to 50 million on information that can lead to his arrest, we have seen reports, for example, not only Trump openly spoke about authorizing CIA operations, covert operations, but there have been reports that the CIA tried, for example, to co-opt the pilot of Maduro's plane. And they would probably be aiming to do what they did to the Mexican cartel leader El Mayo, that they put him in a plane, and then he thinks he's flying somewhere, and then they take him, I don't know, Puerto Rico or El Salvador or something like that. So I think that there is this, they are creating the room or giving the time perhaps for some development in that regard to happen, which is not necessarily Maduro stepping down willingly, but someone else, some other actor inside Venezuela taking a decision that leads to the regime change, as I said before, without necessarily Washington having its fingerprints in that. Just saying, well, we were just fighting drugs in the Western Hemisphere, which is a priority for the Trump administration, and the regime change happened to occur against this backdrop. That would likely be the kind of narrative, also to reduce the responsibility that they would have in terms of, if they did not push for regime change, like concretely, they would have less responsibilities in securing boots on the ground for the new government to securely govern. So something in those lines as well.
Okay. Do you sense a mounting time pressure here? Only because, having a dozen warships and 15,000 troops just stationed up, it's not cheap, right? It's not something you can do forever. So do you get a sense that things are building up to some sort of flashpoint here, or could this last longer than I'm imagining?
Yeah, there is certainly that sort of constraint, both in terms of financial resources, but also in terms of the mobilization of these military assets, right? As I said before, the USS Gerald Ford coming, before it was stationed in Asia, in the Middle East, where you have more often, at least, higher military priorities. And then when you think even domestically in the United States, to which extent now that Congress returned from the shutdown, you may see some mobilization in Congress trying to block these sort of actions in the region. So we do see some time pressure. And one of the drivers that we had in mind in terms of time frame was the designation of Cartel de los Soles as a foreign terrorist organization, as an FTO. This was on November the 24th. Of course, now you have Thanksgiving, and it's highly unlikely that an attack would occur during the holiday, but perhaps right after that, we see an increased likelihood that this next stage of operations, that would be aerial attacks inland, would start to occur. We are thinking that our assessment is that this will become increasingly likely in the coming days and weeks.
Okay, increasingly likely, but you think it's more under the guise of we're targeting cartel-related assets. It's not we're trying to drive overtly regime change. We're just trying to take out the bad drug guys. You're nodding as I'm saying this, but one of the reasons why I'm kind of pressing on this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is as an American, a regular American, I don't get the sense that Trump has the approval yet of just the American public to go invade Venezuela. I mean, I think a lot of people are probably sympathetic to what he's doing there in terms of trying to, overtly, curtail the drug trade. But I don't think any American feels like, hey, I'm not ready to sign up for this yet. In fact, no one's actually made the case to me why we should do this. And obviously, in theory, the president can't even declare war in another country himself. That's something Congress has to do. Leading up to, say, like Iraq, there was long hearings where the current administration back then was sort of selling Congress on why it needed to do this. Like none of that's gone on here. So to your point, like I think the American public would swallow sort of targeted surgical strikes on cartels, but I don't think they'd be cool about U.S. troops, running ashore off of a Navy warship to go fight a jungle battle to depose the dictator.
Yes, that's pretty much in line with our assessment as well, Adam, and the sense that the political costs for the Trump administration would be significantly high. Not only, we're not just talking about the opposition, but even his own support base, right? So that's why this scenario that consists of a military invasion with a large deployment, boots on the ground to force regime change is alongside the one that I spoke earlier about of a negotiated solution. These are the two least likely ones with just 5% likelihood. And we agree
Okay.
that that's the notion that it would be very unpopular for Trump to, as he tried to frame himself as the peace president, and
Hmm.
how he has promised to get the US out of the so-called forever wars and this kind of thing, to engage in a new one that he would start. That's why it's also highly unlikely to occur.
Okay. One thing I didn't mention earlier about steps that were being taken against Venezuela was sanctions. But Venezuela is pretty heavily sanctioned by the U.S. Is there more that sanctions could do, or do we kind of have them on max? And
Yeah, that's tricky because I think there is always room to do more. One of the things that's still on the table that the Trump administration actually revoked and then reinstated was a license that allows Chevron to operate in the country. So in May, the Trump administration suspended all Western companies, their kind of US Treasury licenses to operate in Venezuela despite the sanctions. But then in August, it allowed just Chevron to resume, but a very strict license that it cannot make payments in kind to the Maduro administration, to the Maduro regime, that basically it can swap oil with PDVSA, and then PDVSA then exports this oil and generates some revenue. But that's still a very important source of revenue to the Venezuelan government. So if they wanted to take another critical final step in that regard, this could be it. But I would say that bulk of the sanctions, they came during the Trump's first administration, because in 2017, it blocked Venezuela's access to financial markets. In 2018, it expanded the sanctions to block the purchase of Venezuelan debt. And then in 2019, it also sanctioned other important sectors in the economy, so oil, mining, and banking. So this set of sanctions from the first Trump administration, they are the ones that have done the big negative economic blow to the Venezuelan economy, and they are still in place.
Okay. And Mario, I'm working my way to the opportunities part of this discussion, but a few more questions here. Okay, so we've been talking about U.S. strategy versus Venezuela here. What do the other South American countries think? Are they rooting for one side here?
Yeah, Maduro became increasingly isolated, even within South America, Latin America, after the July 2024 elections. Because since he did not provide proof that he was elected, even other leftist countries in the region, such as Brazil under President Lula or Colombia under President Petro, governments that would be sympathetic to Maduro, they refused to recognize him as president. In addition to that, you had other countries in the region. So leftist countries in Chile under Boric, but also Uruguay, Paraguay, Panama. They recognized the opposition leader, González Urrutia, as the winner. Venezuela broke diplomatic ties. So he became really, really isolated. But despite that, you still have countries, and I would point again to Brazil and Colombia under leftist governments, that although they do not openly support Maduro, they oppose a US military intervention in the region. So it seems just in recent days that President Lula of Brazil was trying to get on a phone call with Trump, trying to discuss the issue for a negotiated solution, something in those lines. So while they do not necessarily back Maduro, I think they oppose even more a US military invasion, or the US kind of forcing a regime change by the use of military force.
All right. Do they support the U.S.? Are they rooting for the U.S. to find a way to get rid of Maduro that's just not, doesn't involve military action?
I'd say most of the countries likely, because they recognize the opposition leader. They have this understanding that Maduro is an illegitimate president, that all the negative economic impacts not only create problems inside Venezuela, but basically when you think about all the migration that kind of has come from Venezuela over the past decades, this has pressured countries in the region. So Colombia, Peru, Chile, all are countries that not only had to deal with immigrants and the social issues that this entails, but because organized crime leverage human trafficking in this kind of exodus, there has been a spike in violent crime or targeted killings, turf wars in countries which were considered safe before, such as Chile, for example. So for these other countries that have to do with the kind of the fallout of the Venezuelan economic and socioeconomic collapse, for them, it would be interesting for their own interests that Venezuela becomes a more stable country that attracts back part of these migrants and that helps stabilize the region rather than continued deterioration that can drive more migration again, for example. That would be bad for everyone.
Okay. Um, I've seen a little bit of this firsthand myself. My sister lives in Colombia, and the last time I was down there, uh, I remember being in Cartagena and just walking around, and it was very clear that the homeless people that were on the street or begging, oftentimes pretty aggressively out of desperation. They were like, "Oh, those are all the Venezuelans." Um, Venezuelans just seem to be pouring out of Venezuela, just desperate, right? And you know, Colombia has its own sort of underemployment problems, but the Venezuelans are at the bottom of that ladder. It was just really acute and heartbreaking to see the plight of those people. And so, I know the Colombians didn't want them there. I know the Venezuelans probably didn't even want to be there themselves. They just didn't have any other choice. So I can see a lot of people rooting for just Venezuela to start solving some of its own problems. And probably most of them have come to the conclusion, as you said, that it's going to require somebody different than Maduro to be doing that. Let me ask you this. What are the average Venezuelans themselves rooting for here? Do we know?
Well, it's hard to say in terms of statistics or polls, but I think the election from July 2024 is a very good proxy because back then, despite the repression, despite the government resorting to its own kind of social programs and cash handouts, trying to retain some sort of popularity, the vote tallies that the opposition gathered and that have been verified, so they can be trusted to an extent, they indicate that González Urrutia got more than 70 to 75% of the vote. So I think that's very telling to the extent to which there is limited support for Maduro. Of course, that it's not to say that he is highly unpopular, and if the US would were to invade Venezuela, there would not be popular opposition, that there will not be armed militias perhaps trying to fight to defend his government, but that would certainly be a minority. While I think that um, even though not all of the 75% would support, for example, a military intervention, they are more likely to oppose Maduro than not.
Okay. And I'm just asking you to wildly speculate here, but if the US did get to the point of military intervention there, do you think the average people would join the US side in trying to dislodge physically the Maduro regime, or is that expecting too much?
I think when we try to think of people taking sides and taking up arms, for example, for either side, I think that would be a minority. Both parts of the radicalized opposition that perhaps would be willing to engage in arms, and also those willing to defend the administration. Part of our scenarios in which we see a regime change and a new administration trying to govern, uh, one of the consequences is if we have an armed conflict, for example, is an increase, another humanitarian crisis in a sense that many people be displaced, like thousands, hundreds of thousands of people displaced either internally or even going again to other countries, as we were talking about before, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Brazil to some extent. So I don't think that we can expect a wave of support and that there will be close to a unanimous position in either way. I think more realistically, you have parts of the population that side with both to the extent they are willing to engage, and parts that would be caught in the crossfire, would be scared, would be worried about, I don't know, their family members, their kids, the elderly, and would perhaps be more willing to relocate and either leave Venezuela again. So I think that's part of the scenarios, how we anticipate things unfolding beyond just the political and economic implications.
Okay. All right. Well, look, in the remaining time we have left, let's get to the perhaps the more hopeful part of this discussion. So let's assume for a moment that there is a material change in Venezuela, and that unlocks the opportunity for Venezuela and the US and Venezuela and other of, kind of Team America's allies, to start, let's say, driving through a lot of the reforms that Miss Machado has been advocating for. And these are things like, reopening Venezuela's economy to the rest of the world. Foreign parties can come in and help Venezuela better tap into its vast natural resources. Hopefully we rebuild the Venezuelan economy and it starts bringing people home and people want to be there and all that good stuff, right? From your perspective, what are some of the biggest components of that opportunity? What are the people who have been focused on this? What are they hoping for most out of it? Is it all about just the oil and gas revenue? Is it about other things? What's the size of this opportunity for the peace dividend that this could yield? What do you think?
Yeah, the good thing is that Machado has an economic team working on this, and they have been, as I said before, kind of road showing this in business forums worldwide. She's in hiding. She has been participating remotely from interviews and this kind of events. And the plan that they have envisioned talks about 1.7 trillion kind of dollars in opportunities over 15 years, and around 40% of that, so 680 billion, would be concentrated in the extractive sector, so both oil and gas and mining. But the understanding that they need to go beyond that as well, to also work on infrastructure, to work on improving education and health, in this idea that they need to improve socioeconomic conditions to attract part of not only the broad kind of migration that happened, but to reverse the brain drain that Venezuela suffered.
Hmm.
And another pillar would, of course, have to be infrastructure, right? So from electricity to water provision to roads and all these kind of sectors that would need to be rebuilt, as you said. And this would likely entail, to some extent, a stable political environment. Also, what they have demonstrated so far, this more pro-business approach, so openness to the private sector with regulatory stability, with clear kind of re-institutionalization of the country with the rule of law. But it would still be a challenge to instill that confidence in investors, right? I think it's not only a change in rhetoric and approach that would be required for for investors to decide to return to Venezuela, especially if in a scenario in which there is still rebels fighting against the government, there is uncertainty if the government will be able to remain in power. And beyond that, when we think about minor issues, there is a column on Bloomberg today flagging that, for example, even the need to rebuild Venezuela's kind of statistics, because you don't have credible data anymore for many, many years. So all of that, it just shows the extent to which it will be kind of a very hard work to rebuild the institutions, rebuild the infrastructure, rebuild the economic sectors to attract the private sector to kind of unleash the potential. But the good news is the oil is there, right? So it's just a matter of operationalize and secure an environment that is favorable to conducting business.
Okay. Um, I mean, it sounds huge for Venezuela. I mean, these numbers are still pretty big too, to even countries like the US. So obviously, there's the opportunity to come in and get ongoing revenues from helping Venezuela rebuild itself and tapping into its vast natural resources, all that stuff. Then presumably, it would also come with sort of some, I don't know if guarantees is the right word, but it would pull Venezuela more towards Team America than towards and away from China and Russia and Iran and whatnot. So it would advance the sort of Monroe Doctrine 2.0 aspirations of the current administration. You're nodding as I'm saying all this. I guess my question is sort of like, how big of a deal is all this, right? If Venezuela flips from becoming a thorn in America's side to a tailwind to its aspirations, how big of a deal is that in sort of unlocking the full potential of the Monroe Doctrine 2.0?
Yeah, it's a big deal because, as you're saying before, it's not just Venezuela alone. I think this speaks to the way the Trump administration views the Western Hemisphere more broadly. So even in Venezuela, we're talking about removing a leftist autocracy from power, so an ideological adversary, so to speak. But when we think about what the Trump administration has done for Argentina, for example, which is an ally, like libertarian President Javier Milei, it's very unprecedented, the level of financial support with a 20 billion currency swap line that the Trump administration has provided just weeks before an election. The promise to work with private sector banks for another 20 billion, which now it seems to be has put kind of shelved, but still. So I think it really speaks to the importance that the Trump administration is going to the Western Hemisphere, and also that reflects a realignment of the US vis-a-vis other regions. So if the US is to focus on the Western Hemisphere, it will likely retreat to some extent its presence in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia. And then there is this understanding that the way that Trump views international relations and the spheres of influence, the US would be happy kind of having this hegemony in the Western Hemisphere and leaving China perhaps to dominate Asia and Russia to deal with the Europeans. So this is just like the tip of the iceberg of what could become a much broader geopolitical realignment that lasts for decades, for example.
Okay. And from your perspective, if we're looking at this as the grand game of risk, played out by the great powers over the world, do you like America's odds here with the strategy? I mean, I kind of get the logic of, hey, we stay here in our own hemisphere, right? We're protected on either side by these massive oceans, right? And we're much more resource rich in many ways than most of those other parts of the world that you mentioned. And we have a lot of untapped resources and a lot of potential for growth, especially in the southern part of the hemisphere, as the Latin American economies get elevated. Um, so I mean, there's a lot to like about it, and there's the circularity of, okay, so we've got some cheap labor down there, but access to good resources, and they're excited because we can help grow their economies, but we like it because we've got a great trading partner, and obviously America's still going to trade with the rest of the world, but I can understand the appeal of the logic. I just don't understand the world chessboard as well as you guys at RANE do. So what do you think?
Yeah, I agree that there is a case to be built for the upside that this could provide. But then, as we say every time, right, where there is risk, there is opportunity. So to take into consideration what could be a potential risk, for example, this would be undoing a world order post the Second World War, the Bretton Woods and everything that followed. That was built on top of US interests, right? So the institutions that we have governing from world finance to world international relations to US military presence by NATO in Europe, by alliances
Yeah,
in Asia.
America's been transatlantically aligned since its formation. So this
Yes,
would be a change to that. Yeah.
and it has expanded that, right, to have key allies in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia. So if you think about retreating from that, of course, yes, you'd be less exposed to engaging in conflict in those regions. You'd be less exposed to either participating in wars or things like that, but you would have less capacity to influence developments there that also affect you. So there is also a flip side, right? So it's hard to say to have a yes, no answer in the terms of is it better or is it worse, good or bad? But there is the kind of this considerations to take from both sides of the argument that each of them perhaps have both risks and opportunities.
Okay. Well, in our last couple of minutes here, Mario, I understand that you are a geopolitical analyst. You're not an economist or a professional investor, but what are there investment opportunities that you think are likely to present themselves as the situation unfolds. I guess I'll end it at that, but I'm guessing maybe there are different investment opportunities, whether they successfully transition Maduro out of there to this great new future we're talking about, or not. And if it doesn't work out well, there's probably ways to trade that too. But do you have any general thoughts on any investment opportunities that a non-Maduro future would create for the average investor?
Yeah, I think that we can refer to what we are seeing, for example, in Venezuela's bonds movements recently, and that shows perhaps the appetite of investors and the way that they see the situation evolving. So Venezuela has, I think, 160 billion in debt to restructure. It has defaulted 2017, and their bonds like traded as low as 10 cents of the dollar, and they were just at 15 a couple of months ago. Now they're up to 30. So there is this indication from financial markets themselves, and of course we're talking about bondholders, and this would be the kind of debt side of things, but they are seeing a growing upside there. So in terms of depending on how the scenario evolves, to which extent it's stable and it instills markets and investors' confidence, there will likely be opportunities and there will likely be companies willing to operate there. Just as I said, like as far as May, we had more oil companies still operating in Venezuela until the US Treasury revoked their licenses. So there is different ways in which risk appetite works for the private sector, and depending on the returns and the conditions on the ground, there will certainly be room for investments to materialize.
All right. Mario, thank you so much. We're here at the end of the hour. This has been super educational. I very much hope that if we have you back on in the future, it's for good reasons, like some of the things that we hope happen are happening, and you can make sense of it for that versus, you know, things ramp up militarily or God forbid, you know, continue to devolve from here. But thank you. When I do these, I usually try to do these as a live stream so that the audience can ask their questions as well. Obviously, I had enough questions to fill the hour here, but we couldn't do a live stream this week anyways, just because of the Thanksgiving holiday and folks' travel and stuff like that. But when we have you on next, I will try to do it live so that the audience can ask their questions here as well. Last question for you, Mario. For people that have really found this discussion very enlightening and they would like to follow you and your work from here, where should they go?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Adam. It was really a pleasure, and glad to be back in the future. And to reach us, just feel free to write to info@ranenetwork.com. So info@ranenetwork.com. Thanks.
Great. And Mario, when I edit this, I'll put up the link there to that email
Perfect.
address so folks know exactly where to go if they want to contact you.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. So folks, please thank Mario for coming on here and educating us about this very important issue. Join me in doing so by hitting the like button and then clicking on the subscribe button below, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. You know, there are investment implications from this. If you'd like to get help from a professional financial advisor to think through how you might want to take advantage of them, feel free to schedule a free consultation with one of the financial advisors that Thoughtful Money endorses. These are the firms you see with me on this channel week in and week out. To do that, just fill out the very short form at thoughtfulmoney.com. And as a reminder, these conversations are totally free. There's no expectation to work with these firms. It's just a service they offer to be helpful to investors. Mario, have really appreciated this. I know you're down there in Brazil, so you guys don't necessarily have Thanksgiving there the way that Americans do, at least on the day that we do, but I still wish you a happy Thanksgiving. And like I said, I very much appreciate you sharing your deep expertise with us on this. And I would like to have you on the program again. And again, I hope it's for good reasons, not for bad.
Yeah, thank you, and happy Thanksgiving over there.
All right, thanks so much. And everybody else, thanks so much for watching.